Welcome to episode 13 of the Discovery Files. Today we're interviewing Jeff Nichols about the discovery of the Helen zone at Cove McCoy. Jeff, if you want to give an intro kind of on what your experience was like during that time.
This was coming out of the low gold price time, and to survive, I had gone over and became a geotechnical core logger at Bingham Canyon Mine for Rio Tinto, and was there about 4 years. Really wasn't. I didn't mind the work, but I didn't like living in the city, and it all kind of came to an abrupt end when my wife was involved in a very horrible car crash in Salt Lake City, and so that's when I decided I needed to get away from that. And that's kind of when the gold price started edging above $300 an ounce. I paid for a trip to go to Roundup in Vancouver that spring, the spring of 2004, and had my resumes and handed them out. And I ran into some folks from Newmont, and Newmont was noticing the same thing, price of gold coming back up. And they were interested into getting people. They obviously had backburnered a lot of projects. And I think as I found out with what I Cove stuff is they actually had acquired additional projects and had no staffing. So I had a really nice meeting with those folks, and I got a call back to drive over to Elko and interview with the local people, and quickly was able to negotiate a contract. I was working as a consultant contractor at Bingham, so I always set up that. And I believe I started for Newmont in March of 2004. And I was handed like 3 projects that they wanted to advance. And Cove was or we called it Cove McCoy, was their primary, the one they wanted the most work on, because they also realized that it was the biggest project and in terms of data. So, yep, I started working on that. There was a lot, about literally a month and a half of sitting in the Elko office organizing horribly or disorganized digital files that were left over from Echo Bay's production years. And, we don't need to go through all the lists, but when you find 45 drill hole access databases and they all look almost the same, it's pretty intimidating.
That's the stuff of nightmares for sure.
It is the stuff of nightmares. And of course, this is like data that was all organized. It was all organized during the 90s, and, that they had gone through their different people. There was, they had a really good chief geologist who I think by and large kept it well managed. But anyway, there was a lot of digital data to sort through. Newmont also required that I learn their proprietary software for preparation of cross sections and the like. And so that was a big learning curve with that. And I had a lot of test fails and stuff on the database. I made some trips out to the project. I met their on-site representative, was a really wonderful man. And I can't come up with his name correctly, so I won't mention it, but he was in charge of, they were in full reclamation mode, including while I was there, they were just finishing tearing down the concentrator. They were, getting rid of the leach pads. I think he had become a Newmont employee by that time because of whatever acquisition Newmont had done with Echo Bay. And his last name is Eric Daniels. Eric Daniels.
Yeah.
And Eric had he actually was really key to getting things going quickly because he had a long history at the project. He was their environmental person, and that's why he moved on. He was like the last standing because of closing down the project. But he worked in the assay lab. He'd managed the assay lab. So there was a lot of internal analysis results and stuff that he could help me out with. I had the entire 3-story administrative building to myself, although not totally to myself. That Eric was there, and then you remember Charlotte Ballou.
Yeah.
Yeah. Charlotte was our. I think Charlotte actually came to Newmont via Echo Bay. Charlotte was there, and she was like managing the. There was a lot of activity actually with the reclamation stuff because it was big equipment. And they were tearing down that gigantic, it was like an 8,000 ton per day concentrator and stuff. So there was a lot of scrapping
So
going on.
So this is like 2004, somewhere in there, right?
Yeah,
Um,
2004, spring of 2004 is when I showed up.
so I think I came there 3 years later, and none of that infrastructure was there anymore. They had
No.
torn it all down by then.
No, and it's really strange because that was a beautiful building. It was like compared to where I am currently, compared to some of the even like the Nevada gold mine sites, it's like really, really stellar. Yeah,
Mhm,
it was just stellar. So anyway, I had the corner office. I was surrounded by bankers' boxes full of data. Um, I was d- I was pressed to come up with a drill program to at least get a feel for what drilling was going to be like, and of course, find mineralization as soon as I could. So I worked through all the databases, and it was actually I did some spreadsheet work and actually did some grade thickness calculations. And I've always kind of been very, proficient with GIS. At the time we only had map info, but I actually made some grade thickness dot maps with stuff that I could get out of access and back and forth. And the lion's share of all the grade thickness had been mined away, and I was really not focused on the McCoy pit. It was lesser grade. It was more like a skarn type thing. It they actually, yeah, it just didn't seem as promising, and so focused on the Cove stuff and realized that 90% of the drilling had been mined out, or and there were some odds and ends in the pit walls. Underneath the pit, there was a pit lake by that time. They turned off the pumps. The history was that the Cove Anacline was a real critical feature, and then northeast cross structures that could or might not have dikes in them were important. So there's a really beautiful map that Nevada Bureau of Mines and Geology published. It's map 103. I looked it up here before we started. It was published by the chief geologist of Echo Bay, Dave Emmons, and one of his, I think, former staff geologists there, but a geologist I know fairly well and who is really good, a guy named Tony Ing. They published that's more than it's like a quadrangle map that's centered on the deposit. So they had taken a lot of they'd actually incorporated uh, pit geology, mine and underground mine geology, like from McCoy into the map, and had a nice straightforward presentation of the stratigraphy, but also the structural geology that included this northwest trending kind of broad open anticline they called the Cove Anacline. And when I had that married to my grade thickness dot map of holes, as I said, most of them were inside of the existing pit and of no value. There were couple off to the northwest, 300 meters, that were, as I recall, they were prefixed BTA, which was, I think it was for beta, BETA, and they were BTA holes. And they weren't very many of them. I think the hole that was of particular interest was BTA 3. And BTA 3 had some pretty serious grade in it, but probably, yeah, it was, as I recall, more than 1,000 feet. It was an RC penetration. And when I organized the balance of the drilling out there, it looked to be nobody had followed it up. And the hole is collared in the post mineral, or maybe possibly syn mineral tough rocks. I think they call them the tough of Cove, and the mineralization was at 1,000 feet or thereabouts, and there was at least 400 feet of that post mineral tough on it. So that became my focus. Um, this is back in 2004. Even at Newmont, we were kind of still had to take care of quite a bit of the upcoming drill logistics ourselves. They did have drilling service, so getting a drill rig was not a problem. Building a road and permitting and building a road ended up being quite an ordeal there because they were in advanced reclamation with the mine site. A lot of the exploration holes or exploration drill roads had been taken care of, and what compounded that as a problem was the fact that you had to get back up on top of this real craggy, ledgy, yeah, ditrophere tough. And so that took a lot of walking. I knew I more or less wanted to twin those holes. I didn't really have a whole lot else to target. They appeared to be coincident with the apex of the anticline. um, I don't recall that I could see the important northeast fractures cutting the tuff, but I more or less just divined, got the very comfortable with the coordinate data. They were on a mine grid there, and went back and recovered those sites. I don't recall that I actually found the sites on the surface. I know I had to recreate the roads. There was nothing that looked like a road. So on or about the 1st of June, Newmont provided a very large, I believe it was, I forget what the Ingersoll Rand rig was. It was with this is before the Boart takeout of Eklund. It was an Eklund rig. And we went up there, and I had money to drill. I think the initial budget I had to drill was 7 holes, but 3 of them were within 200 and no 100 meters of that intercept. That I'm trying to recall the intercept that was in the beta hole. It was something like 15 feet of 0.3 ounce per ton gold. No mention of silver, but definitely a
Take
mention of an anomalous antimony and arsenic. Yep.
Yeah, I'd take 10-gram rock any day, right?
Yeah.
That's pretty exciting for
Yeah.
yeah.
And as I recall piecing together the stratigraphy, it wasn't in that mineralization wasn't in the main mine stratigraphy from the open pit. And this is like Triassic sediments that are there. They appear to be. They reminded me a lot of the rocks on Battle Mountain. It was like an overlap, conglomeratic, shallow marine sort of sediments. And the main rocks they mined in the open pit, this intercept actually existed in rocks just below that. So it was
Mm.
quite exploration like. And I was getting almost zero resistance, no really critique of the how I was organized this from the Newmont management. They just really wanted to get some holes into the thing. So we got an Eklund rig out there, like I say, around the 1st of June. And because there's a pit lake 300 meters southeast of where I collared, as soon as we penetrated the tuff, roughly at about got through the tuff into the Triassic stratigraphy, it started making massive water, just massive water,
Mm.
like 100 gallons a minute easy. Um, I had a real egotistical driller, a name I won't mention, who told me not to worry, that we'd be just fine. And so we persevered and we drilled to TD, everybody's got your TD doesn't necessarily always reflect the depth of target. It's a TD that, well, we don't really care if it's more than 1,800 feet deep. As I recall, the TDs of these were more than 1,500, not quite 1,800. And so we
Yeah, I
drilled.
think that sounds right. Like something
Yeah,
like 1650 or somewhere in there,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And so we drilled. I could tell that the sample quality was suspect, just the amount of water we had. What I was doing was something that I'd learned when I worked over at Battle Mountain for Battle Mountain Gold. They had a really we would fill chip trays for sure, for the record. But I was also had like 3.5 inch diameter styrofoam butter cups. And so I was having the sampler, in addition to filling the sample tray, that he would give me a whole bunch of material in those butter cups, put a lid on it, label it with the footage. And so that's actually what I did the original logging on, to really look at the chips. And
Mm.
so we got those 7 holes drilled. The first 3 looked, just even at the rig, looked interesting. A fair amount of visible sulfide in them. Pretty sure we intersected dikes, because I don't know if you've ever experienced that, where you're drilling a hole and the only thing that comes out of the hole is quartz phenocryst. Because
Yeah. Yeah,
you
you wash away all the clays of the dike.
yeah. So there I had several buttercups full of nothing but, you know, beautiful little quartz phenocryst. So I knew I'd been in was in one of those areas where the dikes were, which were most likely the northeast trending structures. And and then there was, I had the big buttercup gives you more chances to scratch chips because you get bigger chips in there. And I noticed that the rocks were clearly decalcified, quite carbonaceous, a fair amount of very fine grain sulfides, the famous sooty sulfides from the Carlin Trend or the Nevada gold deposits, and also significant white clay veinlets. So I was pretty excited about that. And the assays came in as they always do, like 4 weeks, 5 weeks later, and they started trickling in. And I think the first hole, which was the first three holes were in and around this beta hole that had the nice intercept. The first hole had some lower grade, higher in the more traditional pit stratigraphy. And I think it was more like, a gram and a half, and just standard 5 foot sample intervals. And I think it's the second and third holes, and I think it was especially the third hole is where I ended up getting the nicest assays. And as I recall, there was about 20 feet of 0.27 ounce per ton gold, so whatever, 8-9 gram gold. And I was telling Scott the other day when we started this conversation, I still have the butter cup on my deck, and it's labeled 1500 feet to 1505, and it was 0.486 ounce per ton gold. So whatever, 17 grams, 18 grams gold. And I kept that because it was very, very, very well displayed what were the key elements. The fact that it was a, a dirty carbonate that obviously was very, very broken and had a lot of fracturing, little tiny calcite veins. It had these really distinctive white clay veins. And through the years, it doesn't have as much sulfide in it now because through the years, it would grow a beard of uh, melanchronite or some sort of iron sulfate. And every time it gets wet, that dissolves and it kind of goes away. So it doesn't have as much sulfide in 2025 as it did in 2004. But I'm trying to recall. I think I was estimating through the mineralized zone, there was more than 2% and as much as maybe 7 or 8% fine grain sulfide in the mineralized zone. And I
Mm.
don't remember the name of the stratigraphy, but it was a more massive carbonate unit under the more conglomeratic.
Because there yeah, I'm trying to think because you had Smelser Pass, and then you went
Seltzer
down to,
Pass is
like,
the hanging wall, and then
yeah, and then there's, like, Panther Canyon.
Panther Canyon, and Panther Canyon had like a conglomeratic unit that looked like the Battle Formation over at Battle Mountain, but
Yeah.
it's Triassic. And then it had more of a siltstone, limey siltstone part of that seemed to be the main host at Cove. And then
Mhm.
and then it's is it Home Station? I think it might be Home
Yeah, yeah,
Station.
yeah, home station next, yep.
Yeah, but it's a more massive unit that, I'm back in the day, I don't think they targeted just because it was a more massive unit. But
Yeah.
this just more or less proved that the system's so robust out there, having the dikes in and around that, whatever fracturing and structural prep was going on in the Cove anticline, that was enough that you could have significant grade. I've always been suspicious of what the Helen zone is tonnage wise. I don't know that you could get a 15 or 20 million tons into those rocks, but maybe you can. But for sure, there was high grade mineralization in that setting.
Mm.
So,
Yeah,
and
it's pretty interesting stuff, right? Because I remember, like, I mean, I was there years later, and um, I remember Raul was talking about, oh yeah, these Newmont people had no idea what they were doing, and like the best units, the Favret, and they never targeted it. And I just remember looking at it and like, and I think Mike Russell worked there, and he was like, Newmont had a hard rule on how deep you could dig, how deep you could drill during that time. So it's not like they missed it. It's just they weren't allowed to
Well,
do it,
so
right?
there is something to say about that. I was, in the days since we've first talked, Scott, I was trying to think. I think I was able to drill 3 rounds, and I think the second round I was still in enough close that I got some interesting mineralization. The third round, I was told to step out and, typical big company, step out and, wingspan or whatever, and just drill dusters at that point. And I made a budget request for a fourth round that said it was time to drill core because none of these analysis were none of these samples were good quality. They just weren't.
Yeah, yeah.
They just weren't. I
Probably have
mean,
all sorts of cyclicity problems with, like, because
also,
it's RC under the
well,
water table, right? And it's
and remember the famous story that is the Cove deposit from Echo Bay days. They built the 8,000 ton per day concentrator based on bad assays because they were drilling high water table and there was almost no core in that. So they overbuilt the concentrator by about 50% what they actually needed. Oh, it's
wow.
very famous, very famous. In fact, there's an AIME presentation on it. No, Echo Bay oversized the entire mine based on bad RC samples.
A couple of the other interviews we've done, people emphasized how important core drilling was early in the discovery process. And this is kind of because like, and I'm hoping to get other people from Victoria and other companies on later. But it was one of the things that they did do is they drilled all diamond with Victoria. And like, so you're talking about like the dikes that was just quartz phenocrysts and the chip trays. We actually had one of those dikes squeeze on the back end reamer of the drill and lathe through it with those quartz phenos.
Oh, wow.
So
Wow.
it's like I was just blown away. But like you at least had an idea of what you were confronting when you were drilling diamond. But with RC, that's such a challenge, right? Like you don't have any of the structural context and
Well,
and
and when you go
so
water, right? So it's been my experience in general, when you can drill RC with a hammer, it's just a minor detail, but it actually benefits the geologist, is the chips tend to be bigger. Well, once you hit
yeah,
that
yeah,
water and the hammer no longer functions, which was pretty, once you went 100 gallon at 800 feet, you went tricone. And my experience is the top tricone grinds everything. It's like grinding it 3 times before it
yeah,
comes up the
yeah,
hole. And so you end up with like these at best you'll get a centimeter size chip, but mostly you're getting chips half a centimeter and maybe even less on average, particularly if it's really something hard, right? It just grinds it down to
yeah,
nothing.
yeah.
So that's the challenge, like trying to interpret the geology. And in this particular holes, when we hit the water, absolutely 1,000+ feet down the hole, everything's black, but there would always be some orange and yellow and pieces of tuff in every one of those buttercups. You knew it was not. They did, it was raveling from the top of the hole clear to the bottom.
Oh, so what were you feeling during this time? Because I mean, like, there's probably a mix of things, right? Like, there's probably a lot of excitement about actually hitting the target, right? Because how many times have we drilled holes to twin old programs,
Oh yeah,
and you find that there's just nothing there, right? So you're hitting
yeah. You
things.
that there was, it was a collar problem, or there was, whatever. Yeah, there's some whole identification. No, like I said, I had literally the corner office in that 3-story building. I had the best light. I had myself set up to log these buttercups with these bigger chips. And right, I'm 40 miles from Battle Mountain. I'm 110 miles from Elko. Nobody was bothering me and stuff. So I had the luxury of looking at this stuff really hard. And that's why
Mm,
I've mentioned several times the importance of noticing those white clay veins.
yeah.
That was what really got me excited, is I could see the very fine grained attractive sulfides, but to see that it was a, I was imagining what it would look like in core. It was probably a crackle breccia with
Mm,
white clay veins, and near one of these dikes, near one, really imagining near one of these big northeast structures that ramified away from the stock over at McCoy, and um, another thing I wanted to mention, Scott, you were never at Cove when it was in production, were you?
no, never was. Yep.
There's a misnomer about that district. The reason they built a concentrator is because most of their ore was associated with galena and salarite that they mined in that
Now
open.
that's really interesting. So I've actually got a piece of rock from behind me that we found on one of the waste dumps they'd set aside, where it was like a lot of limestone in this one area of the waste dump, and then they'd stack this little pile of extreme sulfide on there, and it's sphalerite and galena, and so I've always been kind of intrigued by just how different
It's
that
very
part of
different.
the
It's so
yeah.
different. It's so when they realized they built the mill too big, and they realized that as they're mining the open pit, plus, the little bit of ore tons coming out of the McCoy, they actually had to scale back their concentrator, and they would campaign ore types through the concentrator to maximize recovery. So they would do a
Man,
big galena run, and then they do a big salarite run. And then they and what we were intersecting over at the Helen zone never went to any concentrator ever because
so
it
that's
wouldn't
pretty
have
interesting
worked.
because that's
It
yeah,
would
because that's
not
the
have worked.
Carlin styles,
Yeah.
like rocks, right? So you would have needed like a roaster or
And
an
I and I
autoclave or
and I
something
I
like
did a
that.
little research a couple nights ago. Cove was North America's biggest silver mine for 5 years running in the early 1990s.
No kidding. Huh.
They were producing almost 10 million ounces of silver a year for from like 93 to 97.
Wow. That is so wild to think about. It's like, because my experience there was all Helen Zone. We did some mapping in Cove and in McCoy. But in terms of like all the core I ever saw there was all from the Helen Zone, and it was all city sulfides, right? And
And
so it's
like,
just kind of interesting to think about
yeah, no,
how
I
little.
remember in the hole with the point 0.4 grade in it, there was fairly coarse stibnite, not with the gold directly, but in the space of the gold.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And so the thing I learned, and has made a huge impression on me ever since, is the fact that this concept of a zone system is absolutely truly valid, and my type deposit to actually explain that to people, and I've done that as a consultant to some clients who they wanted they I have a Carlin trend thing, and I said, well, no, you need to consider this. It's a distal disseminated Carlin like thing, but it's not a Carlin. I remember going into the pit in 1992 when they just opened up and they had all this mammoth equipment, and we got to go into that very distinctively conglomeratic unit, and you could find class replaced by galena more than 2 centimeters across. And it had silver and gold in it both.
I think that's one of the things that I love about Nevada geology is it's so easy to bin things as like, oh, it's Carlin, Carlin's system. And I think it's a really valid point is there's lots of Carlin like things
Yeah, Carlin
that
light
are not.
is a useful word, is a very useful word.
Yeah.
It seems like I don't want to say childish, but low tech or whatever, but it's a really useful word. It's a really
Yeah.
useful word.
I guess the totality of these systems of, like they're very complex. There's lots of different, stages going on. I remember working for Victoria. It was really enjoyable. We had projects all over the state in kind of a variety of different like settings. And I just remember looking at some of these things and being like, there's so much variety in this state. And so many people would call this all the same rock, all the same ore type, and it's really not. And
No,
it's
no. I mean, I'm thinking of there's now you really got me some of the commonalities, say like with the Carlin, the Carlin trend or Cortez. I mean, Cortez is actually not that far away from Cove McCoy. It's really interesting, and I don't know if you ever got to do that with Victoria, but the south part of the district is iron skarns related to a Jurassic pluton. It was a fairly productive magnetite, hematite iron skarn during the wartime. And that aureole, that contact aureole associated with that impinges on the contact aureole and skarn. The rocks that got skarned and mineralized with gold in the Eocene at McCoy Pit actually had a precursor contact aureole from the Jurassic there. So it
so
starts to
it's
be
I just
really,
remember we did go down and walk around some of those areas that had been mined, like kind of sketchy open pits and things
yeah,
like that.
yeah,
And it's kind of funny, thinking back, like, I think this was my second job out of college. And so like I knew so little of what I was seeing, especially since my first job was in the Comstock, and it was like looking at a very different type of system, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so I just remember being struck with how much I needed to learn when we're walking around and mapping in this area. And thankfully, I worked with some great geologists, and so they were infinitely patient with me to map. But yeah, it's like it's kind of delving back to the roots of me learning geology in this area. So,
Yeah. Well, I say it is a really interesting district.
so I guess what are some of the things that surprised you the most? Because like I'm sure you probably saw press releases from coming out. So what were some of the things that you were thinking as you were seeing them talk about this discovery? Because like one of the things we've explored in some of our other episodes is like discovery is really like a movie, right? Where we often talk about it like as it's a single frame that exists and like, oh, this was discovered here by this person, but it's all this pre-work that was done by these people. You think about the mapping that the Echo Bay Geos did, and yeah, and it's like, and then the work you had done. It's like that's all like critical to the ultimate success. So what did you feel when you saw all these press releases and stuff coming out, kind of claiming that it's their original ideas and you know?
Well, so there is a kind of a maybe a summary statement that I'll make about my experience there. So I got to drill 3 rounds. Um, by the time I'd finished the second round, Newmont offered me a staff position based on the fact that I had provided good results in a timely fashion. So I ended up with a staff job, and that met my personal needs. I couldn't live in Salt Lake no more. My wife couldn't drive in Salt Lake no more. We had a way out, and that was uh, and that was the start of my 15-year career at Newmont. I mean, that was the emotion that made me the most happy.
Digging deep where the stories hide, through the hills and the mountains wide. Pickaxe swing and the earth unfolds, chasing dreams in the dirt and gold. Geology calling under our feet, secrets are buried in the rock and heat. With a heart full of wonder and a map in hand, exploring the treasures of this great land.